Pride and jealousy are the two passions that we have come across so far in the story of A Vizier's Daughter by LILLIAS Hamilton, presented to you on the Hazara Pioneers Library at Mechidtv. In chapter 13, we saw the father departing towards the war, and Gul Begum, who has escaped, is brought back to Muhammad Jan. And in chapter 14, we shall witness how she passed through the bondage. As وقت بندية Gul Begum بندية وهي بندير شي رقم تيرنا. Chapter 14, Bondage. After her father's departure, Gul Begum, half paralyzed with misery, sat down quietly among other women, her mind too dulled even to formulate good intentions. No one spoke to her. No one noticed her, which perhaps after all was the very kindest thing they could have done, though they did not know it. In 4 days, Hussain has said, I shall be at the front. So for 4 days, Gul Begum was left in peace. But when those 4 days, and with them all chance of his return to see after to well-being of his daughter was past, matters changed very much indeed for the worse. Muhammad Jan was so convinced that all the Hazara efforts would end in failure, and so certain, therefore, that the rewards promised by Ghulam Hussain would never be forthcoming. Muhammad Jan دی فکر بود که آزرا کاری که میخواه کنه در جنگ بردنی نیه و قانش ده بود که وقتی که تباه و برباد شده دیگه او وعده و وعیدی که وزیر صاحب شده که این چیزا ما ترمیدم هم نمیرسه دیگه. That he no longer took any pains to conceal his intentions and character. که بنالی بعد از این او نمیخواست که چیز را مخفی کنه که ما بگم یا نگم یا ای کار کنم یا نکنم. It pleased him to bully a woman. خوش مشد که اذیت کنه. یک زنی را who had been brought up in a refined and comfortable home, and who had occupied a singularly responsible position in her own village. مسئولیت داشت، از خود خو نظر داشت، انفرادی بود. It was his nature to wish to do so, just as it is some children's nature to love pulling off the legs and wings of flies and beetles. امر کم که بعض دوستو می مرچه را یا مثلا یه زنبور که پایش نمیکنه خوش میشه. این میرقم محمد جان خوش میشد که این دختری که در نزاکت کتاش ده و رضایت کنه. He meant little by it. It just amused him. خوش آمد. But in Gul Begum's case, he had a special grievance. His father, long time ago, Muhammad Jan's father, had asked her father for the girl's hand in marriage for his son some time before, partly, of course, because she was an undoubtedly fine girl and the daughter of one of the chief men in the country, but also, more especially, no doubt, because Ghulam Hussain was known to be a rich man, and he made no secret of his devotion to his eldest daughter. Without doubt, a large dowry would be hers. این برنامه که داشت که پدر شمده بود، پدر محمد جان چند وقت چند ماه پیش اینا گفته بود نه ما نمیدی دختر خورا. This proposed marriage had been rather scornfully declined. شما رسیلکن مو خانتما آدمای وزیرست شما کارگر آدم مزدور کار برید پشت کار خو. Yet the previous year, when danger and difficulty threatened, the vizier had been only too ready to make use of the house that he had not considered good enough for her permanent home. حالی که مصیبت هم ده تو مگیانون دو مخانه برو. As a temporary refuge for the girl. که بازم اگر میداد دختر را در روسی بازم یک گپ بود. And moreover, to justify the fact of her paying so long a visit, and also the better to secure her safety from the man who molesting her, he had gone so far as to have her named on him. There was nothing noble, nothing gracious or chivalrous in all Muhammad Jan's composition. یک کرامت دمنیز و معلوم نمشد. یک خاصیت خوب. He did not feel in the least honored by the trust reposed in him. امی قدرم نمفود که همون چطور یک نفر اعتبار خوب بلیستو که دمی زمانی جنگ. He cared nothing whatever for the girl herself, excepting that he had been told she was an excellent cook. But he would have liked to have had that dowry, and he also felt that he would like to have been able to tell other women that he had secured the Hazara beauty. خود یک جلسی در داستان است که ما چطور این دختر گیر نتونستم بهی. All this satisfaction was denied him. However, so he felt sore and aggrieved. این قین مخرى همزو زمان. That to his mind meant that he owed Gulbegum a grudge. پرخ گرفتنیه. And he meant to pay it. The previous year, he had been somewhat restrained owing to the uncertainty as to the final issue of the war. پارسال چندان معلوم نبود که جنگ کدام طرف ماره. زود قوی میشه، میچله چیکار میشه. اما کم همیتر آرام بود، یک طرفه بود. This year he felt free to do as he chose. So convinced was he that ere long the girl would be fatherless and homeless. She would then, of course, be his to do what he liked with. که حالا خورفته اون دم جنگ ممره باز ما مفهمم که از بعد قضیه چیز کار کنم. But that was a poor consolation after all, for with Ghulam Hussein's downfall, his house would, of course, be searched, his goods confiscated, and he, Muhammad Jan, would find himself with a very fine wife, no doubt. But with one who had absolutely no dowry, and all this might so easily have been avoided, so it seemed to him, by a little foresight on the part of her father. Without doubt, he owed them a grudge. قد خود خو قانعه که مثلا نالی ما را نه اینا دختر داد به زدم کد مورا جواب داد باز وقتی مصیبت ما داماد تاویل زمو کد باز درست حسابی کسته کدام چیزی هم مورا توفه و تحایف هم نداد ایره دیگه اینالی جنگ خلاص شنه باز ما مفهمم دزی. During her first visit to his house, Gulbegum had, or at least her grandmother had, stipulated for her that she should in no wise feel herself obliged always to eat with the family. And by not presenting herself at the ordinary meal times, she had forced her hostess sometimes to serve her meal apart from the others. Now she was forced to eat alone, and to be thankful for the scraps that were thrown across at her. یک چند توتل نانی خشک پیش من تناونو منشر پیش. Go fetch some drinking water, Muhammad Jan had called out to her one day, and see that you are sharp about it. زود بریم یک گلاس آب بیارو. Muhammad Jan یک روز مگه. I am not your servant. The girl had replied firmly, remained seated. Ah, is that so? The man had replied brutally. Then as you are not my servant, and you are certainly not my relative, you have no right to my food. You can go without. So all that day she never broke her fast. Hunger compelled her to a certain amount of submission, and she was not really unwilling to help the other women with their household work. It was Muhammad Jan's orders that she so resented. دمزو گشنگی هم قد دیگه کمک مکد اما ای کاری محمد جان اصلا دیگه سرخم نمکد پیش. One morning she was engaged in braiding her hair. The luxuriant, raven tresses of which her father had been so justly proud in the usual elaborate fashion of her countrywoman. When Muhammad Jan called her. I am engaged, she replied quietly. I cannot come just now. خلاص نیستم علی. Don't dare to tell me you cannot come. You will do as you are bid, he shouted. Come to me here at once. But the girl sat still, finishing the braiding of her hair. She thought she was safe from molestation, so long that she was in her own apartment, at any rate. But she was mistaken. Her tormentor had no scruples. Listen to me, he said, appearing suddenly in the doorway. Goshko, I am tired of all this pride and nonsense. What you must do is to cease all this braiding of hair and vanity. Such things are not for women in your position. You must learn to obey, and I am the man who is both willing and able to teach you. You refuse to become my wife, and your father refuses to give you to me in marriage. So be it. I am not particular as to ceremonies. Your father's wishes I am by no means obliged to consider. He has left you here for me to feed and protect, without so much as paying a single piece for your keep. And as to your wishes, you are a woman and should have none. Either you consent here, now, at once to become my wife, or I will treat you in such a way as to make you beg me to make you my wife. Mind you, if you let matters come to such a pass at that, my God, you will make your entreaties in vain. Do you see this rope? Do you see this rope? He went on, flourishing a piece he held in his hand. Rope is a useful article. It can bind, it can lash, and it has other uses. And as he spoke, he brought it down with a sharp flick across the girl's shoulders and arms, making her jump and causing the tears to start in her eyes against her will. Still, she said nothing. Now listen to me, he went on. You elected to stay in this room when I called you to come down to me. It is well, you shall remain here. I should be sorry not to oblige you, but lest you should feel inclined to leave it, you shall be bound hand and foot to prevent you doing so, that you may have the full benefit of your own choice. When you have come to your senses and are willing to submit, you can call for me if you like. And if I am in the house and unoccupied, I will perhaps come to see what you want. And as he spoke, he knelt on her and tried to force the rope around her. But Gulbegum was strong and lithe and active, and in spite of the smarting pain Across her shoulders, she struggled and resisted to the uttermost. Here, you woman, Muhammad Jan called out. Ho, there! Come upstairs and help me with this vixen. And they came. Glad to see the girl whose air of superiority had so often galled them. In such sore straits and trouble. And so among them they bound her. And bound her tight too. Then left her almost fainting with pain, fatigue, and humiliation. Dard, khastagi, beizati, bandi, bandi. Left her without a scrap of food or a drop of water, nor could she have partaken of either if she had had them. So tightly were her arms bound down to her sides, and the hours dragged on slowly. Slowly. But the evening, it seemed to the poor suffering girl that she must have lain there a whole year. By the evening, every event of her life passed before her as in a pageant, and she wondered why God has placed so heavy a curse on her. Wondered if it was indeed just punishment for her pride. A pride of which she had so often been accused, but of which, truth to tell, she felt so very little. Why do they call me proud? She asked herself. How do I show myself to be so much more vain than other women? Who works harder than I when I am at home? Who is more submissive to her parents? And then the tears trickled down her cheeks and fell one by one on the mud floor on which she was lying. She had been obedient even when obedience had brought her to this, the deepest of degradation. Ah, Father, she sobbed. I knew how it would be. I knew. I saw it coming last year when I ran away. And though you love me, yes, I know you do, you would not listen to me. Your thought I did not know, but I knew. Alas, too well, Father. Father, where are you now? Far, far away from here, protecting your country from its enemies, your poor country which nothing can save. While your wretched, suffering child, your own flesh and blood, lies here encompassed by a far more deadly foe, a far more relentless enemy. Father, Father, she murmured, but only the voice of the wind replied, the wind that was blowing from off the mountains of her beloved home, and which, lifting her hair, the hair she had not even finished braiding, fanned her aching temples and her burning, throbbing head. The sun set and the moon rose. Such a beautiful, bright, eastern moon. She could hear the regular Hazara giggle going downstairs, and every sound tortured her. She remembered old Maryam's words. Rejected, a prisoner, a slave. Here was the fulfillment of that dire prophecy already. Was ever prisoner so bound? Was ever slave so punished? a weird shadow passed slowly between her and the moon. It was a great dun-colored owl. She knew by the peculiar swishing of its wings, and she knew too that according to the superstitions of her race, such a visitor boded no good. And oh, how cold she was getting. Her limbs were quite numb. The very blood in her veins seemed to be stopped by the encircling cord. Her head grew dizzy, and then Providence was kind to her at last, for she lost consciousness. As dard was gham. And all her tortures, both mental and physical, were for the moment as though they were not. The next thing she was conscious of was something licking her. Now her hands, and now her neck, and then her face. She started, there was something so uncanny in the sensation. It was broad daylight, subshuda, and a great sheepdog that she had often petted and fed had come to show its sympathy with her in her trouble. Yaksagi, Malar Mubardama, Iran man be the fish, come Nazmi the Uamdaki, Iranaz be the Thames. A dog is everywhere considered by Mohammedans an unclean beast. By Musulmana, sag najisa. And deservedly so. For in the East, he is one of the most common and at the same time of the most useful of the many scavengers in providing which nature has been so bountiful. For a moment, only a moment, the girl was filled with disgust and horror. Then a new feeling, born of her loneliness and misery. In her loneliness and misery came to her, and she bent towards her this humble friend, an outcast like herself. Amitar mardud, rachudat, nakhanda, rubbing her head on its shaggy, dusty brown coat, because she could not undo a hand herewith to stroke it. The sun rose higher and higher, but still no sound came from below. Rose chachudak, ej sarsadana maya, ej kasni faqad khana. The house seemed to be deserted. A kind of terror seized her and shook her from head to foot. Had they all gone away and left her? Martana product daminji. Bound and helpless to starve, keminjes gushnagi bumrum. The outer door must evidently have been left wide open, or the dog could not have got in. Fearless as she was of the consequences of what would seem to Muhammad Jan to sever of submission, her terror at being forsaken was too great to admit of any other feelings. وفعلا ذي فكر نبض كي تشي فكر منا ومقفت أجر مارا مش برتاك ده باش باز مگر درجة واز باش تشنسك تشي خمامات داخل خانة. She must call, and call she did. Dad faryad chbalch. Falani, falani, komag. But how husky her voice. It seemed to have no strength, to have lost all its carrying power. She called and called again, but still no one replied. Only the dog snuffed around about her and then lay down, placing its head affectionately on her bosom. Again she called, but still No reply came. At last, nerved even to desperate deeds, she rolled and wriggled towards the door. To the stairs and then down. The fresh morning air fanned her brow and gave her hope such as a few moments before she seemed impossible. But the hope soon died within her, for there, grinning all over his face at her contortions and struggles, stood Muhammad Jan. Kuja. And behind him the little herd, who was to have carried her letter to her father. On muchopo, que me khadar de dani buti boda padare mersanno. Qazista budi chugul khorde. Hardish yakshda. You must be hungry, he said. Come, I will give you some food. And he went inside and fetched her some bread and water, which he placed within her reach, had her arms been unbound, but he did not offer to unfasten the rope. Why don't you eat, huh? Mocking her. It's not food for you want. Oh, huh? But the girl, relieved from her first great terror, made no reply. Weeks and months passed on. But over the tortures, the insults, the degradation to which the Vizier's daughter was exposed during that time, it is best to draw a veil. Only one point she made and kept. She refused to be Muhammad Jan's legal wife. She could not but believe that someday she would escape. Someday she would find a means of returning to her father's house. And when that day came, she wished to be free. She would have no legal tie to bind her and force her back to a misery that was worse than death. News of war reached her from time to time. Muhammad Jan made no attempts to keep it from her. It was part of his amusement to tell her of the privations to which her fellow countrymen was exposed. At first, she had found a reply to much that he had had to say, and had more than once asked him when he was going to join the combatants. But after a time, she ceased to make any remark. Once he was away for 3 whole weeks. And then the girl felt as though the millennium had come. The jeers and laughter of the woman were nothing compared to what she had had to put up with from him. She was given the coarsest of food and was not even allowed to wash her clothes. What do you want clean clothes for? Muhammad Jan's mother asked her one day. Why? She is going to be married. I should think and want all her things got ready. Another one joined in. Isn't that it, Gulbegum? The girl said nothing. It's nothing but vanity, the older woman went on severely. nothing but the vanity that is inborn in her, and which she inherits from her father. That's what's the undoing of her. تمام بدبختي زي يعني غرور زي. Ah, soft, silly fool, can't you even now see where your own best interests lie? أمي خوي بديخ مفهميتو. Your father is dead by now, ho? You may be sure, and your mother and all your people slaves, and your home deserted and desolate. Can't you see what a mistake you have made in not submitting from the first? از روز اول که تابع ما بودی تو می روز مرسیدی. Why, you might have had a good home here, and Muhammad Jan would have made you a good husband if you had treated him properly in the beginning. گفتم روز اول گفتم ترى. The girl shivered. Yes, shiver away. The old woman went on, incensed. A long time ago, I told my son what he ought to do. گفتم پنج دادم که نیت کانو. You want to have your nose cut off? That's what you want? That would take the vanity out of her a bit, I should think, she said, turning to address the other woman, who giggled and nudged one another. Gul Begum said nothing. She knew these women dared not do anything to her while the master of the house was away. When Muhammad Jan returned, he was in high good mood. He brought some presents for his women and soon afterwards brought a number of goats and sheep. From a neighbor who was satisfied that any day the Afghans might come down on them, as they had already done on so many other villages, and would seize his animals without offering any payment at all. Muhammad Jan also brought fresh news of the war and seemed rather to despise than to sympathize with his fellow countrymen in the struggle they were making for liberty. يمسايا زيمك چندنا مال خورماير پیش زيمگا امير تو محمد جان نگاه کو بیزم خو افغانان دنیا تمام الدنيا را تباهی گرفته تمام برباد شد و از جنگ خبری جنگ می است که محمد جان بجای کی بوده که طرفی نفجای قومی خود خور بگیره زبیت بد گفته رایی مگه نه. The mullahs, he said, tried to stir up the Hazaras in Kabul, and they did succeed to a certain extent. Without doubt, for the mullahs have great power. But some of the Hazaras had experienced a great kindness at their master's hands. خب اینا لازرگو زیاد چی که دمنی کابل است در طرف کابل مزدورکاری نه جوالیگری نه داشته نواد و در خانه مردم کار نه کاره درسته پیش خدمت و غیره خادمه نوکره غلامه اینجی ملا گسته اینا را در شور آورده که اینی کار کنید که اینجی امیر مجبور شونه که لشکر خور پس بخواه از اونجی باز اونا باید امیر خم دراگیر کنه مو باز امیر خم دی ای پلان از اونا بود. اما چند مردم حاضره که از دیستی آقای خو خوش بودن اینا کسته خبر میرسنه که مولا چیز برنامه داره اینجی and knew when they were well off, so they betrayed the plot. My word, you should have seen the carnage that followed. The mullahs were taken and tortured till they told the names of all who were concerned in this scheme. توتا که جوابی کیه قضیه شما؟ کی برنامه را ساخته؟ که شما در خلاف امیر طغیان باغی شدن؟ Which was to have caused a universal rising of every Hazara in the Kabul Valley. The rebels were hanged, the mullahs cut to pieces, and every Hazara has had a spy put on him. So they are having a lively time for their trouble. اینا تمام شتایت نظره ولی هر حضره شک و مشکوک میشه داره. Gul Begum's blood simply boiled, but she said nothing. Your father is dead, he said, and so is your uncle. But still the girl said nothing. Fortunately, she did not believe him, though her anxiety was increased to an almost unbearable extent. Nor was she disappointed. Weeks passed and the summer was nearly over when one day Ghulam Hussain rode up to Muhammad Jan's house. And demanded his daughter. Her piteous condition, her disheveled hair spoke volumes. He did not need to ask any question, nor even look at her suffering face. Besides, he had heard something of the treatment she had received from the little herd to whom the girl had shown many kindness, and who had been truly shocked to see her bound and ill-treated as she had been the morning she had wriggled down the stairs in terror at being deserted and left to starve. I owe you no payment, except one that you shall not fail to receive in him, the injured father had said. I would shoot you now, here, in cold blood, traitor that you are. But that is the reward due to a soldier, and a man, and not to such as you. But mark my words. It may be long in coming, but your fate is sealed. You shall not die in your bed. The girl was weak and weary. Not so weary, however, but that by putting her foot on her father's, she could mount his horse and ride home behind him. That was chapter 14. That's chapter 14. Nosago, with the bakulo and ajego, hopefully you have been saddened by the story. Yeah, me too, yeah. It's a sad story indeed of the time when the Hazara war begins with the Amir of Kabul and the arms and ammunition that is blowing fire upon every village. It's all depicted in the pain of Gul Begum. And a pain, whether it be individual or collective, is like a fire that burns, hopefully to mature, to cook, so that you learn from what is painful. So collectively, for all those young teenagers, wherever in the Hazara communities around the world you may be, forgetting the pain that the previous generation has paid means you will have to experience the pain again. Would you like to experience the pain again? Torture again, war again, migration. For 130 years, war and migration is the destiny of the Hazara communities around the world. Migration and war are the two words. That's why it is better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. And the war is jealousy against jealousy. It's very dangerous. Haikido, Nowruz Zawar. Catch up next one.